Tonight, you will lie down, close your eyes, and cease to exist. Not permanently, you hope, but for a few hours, the person you are, the one thinking these thoughts, aware of this room, will simply stop. Your consciousness will dissolve. Your body will be paralyzed, deliberately by your own brain, so that you cannot move. You will be almost completely defenseless, unable to detect danger, unable to respond to threat, lying still in the dark for a third of your life. And you will do this, willingly, every single night, without a second thought, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. It is not ordinary, it is astonishing. Every night you surrender your awareness and your body and trust, without any real assurance that you will get them back in the morning. If you had never experienced sleep and someone described it to you, it would sound like a nightmare. You will lose consciousness, be paralyzed, hallucinate vividly, and remember almost none of it. No one would volunteer for such a thing, and yet you cannot be talked out of it. The need for it is so absolute that if you resist long enough, your brain will simply impose it on you, seizing sleep in microscopic fragments even while your eyes are open, taking by force what you would not give. And yet, you cannot live without it. Deprive a person of sleep long enough, and they will die, faster than if you deprive them of food. The nightly disappearance is not a weakness or a waste. Think about what you actually do, every night of your life, without ever finding it strange. You go to a room, you lie down, you deliberately make yourself vulnerable, removing your clothes, closing your eyes, letting go of vigilance. And then, at some moment, you cannot locate and will never remember. You vanish. There is no felt transition, no experience of falling asleep. There is being awake, and then there is nothing, and then there is morning. You have no memory of the crossing, because there is no one there to remember it. The self that is reading this sentence will end tonight and, you assume, resume tomorrow, and you will call the one who wakes by your own name without a moment's doubt. You have done this perhaps 10,000 times, or 20,000, and never once found it remarkable. But it is remarkable. It is the one experience of ceasing that you undergo regularly and survive, a nightly rehearsal of the disappearance of the self, so familiar that you have stopped seeing it at all. The nightly disappearance is not a weakness or a waste. It is one of the most essential and least understood things your body does, and one of the strangest things about being alive. Why would evolution build such a thing? Consider how dangerous sleep is. An animal asleep cannot watch for predators, cannot flee, cannot fight, cannot feed, cannot mate, cannot do any of the things that keep it alive and pass on its genes. For a third of every day, it lies helpless in the dark, a defenseless meal for anything that finds it. By every logic of survival, this should have been eliminated, bred out, replaced by something less catastrophically vulnerable. And yet sleep is everywhere. Every animal that has been carefully studied sleeps, or does something very like it. Fish sleep. Insects sleep. Creatures with almost no brain at all show sleep-like states. Some animals have gone to extraordinary lengths to keep sleeping under impossible conditions. Certain birds sleep while flying. Certain sea mammals sleep with one half of the brain at a time, so the other half can keep them swimming and breathing. Evolution did not eliminate sleep. It engineered elaborate workarounds to preserve it, even in creatures for whom lying still would be fatal, which can mean only one thing. Whatever sleep is doing, it must be so important, so utterly non-negotiable, that it is worth the enormous danger of spending a third of your life unconscious and helpless. So what is it doing? What could possibly be worth that price? The ubiquity of sleep in the animal world sharpens the question. It appears not only in mammals and birds, but far down the tree of life, in reptiles, in fish, in insects. Even the simplest creatures with nervous systems show states of reduced responsiveness that meet the criteria of sleep, and if deprived of them will compensate by taking more later, exactly as we do. This suggests that sleep is not a late invention of complex brains, but something ancient, present near the origins of nervous systems themselves, so fundamental that it may have arisen alongside the very first neurons. Whatever function it serves is apparently required by nervous tissue itself, not just by the sophisticated cortex of a mammal. and the workarounds evolution has produced, the half-brain sleep of certain sea mammals and birds, the sleeping on the wing of migratory species, are the strongest possible testimony to its necessity. The half-brain solution is worth picturing because it is so extraordinary. Certain dolphins and whales cannot afford to become fully unconscious because they must surface to breathe. A fully sleeping dolphin would drown. And so they sleep with one hemisphere of the brain at a time, one half showing the slow waves of deep sleep, while the other half remains awake and vigilant, one eye closed and the other open, swimming and surfacing and watching for danger, while half the brain rests. Then the halves switch. Certain birds do something similar, sleeping one hemisphere at a time, while perched at the edge of a flock, keeping the outward-facing eye open for predators. And some migratory birds appear to snatch sleep in brief episodes while airborne on long flights. Evolution, confronted with animals for whom lying unconscious would be lethal, did not simply remove their need for sleep. It invented one of the most remarkable adaptations in biology so that they could keep sleeping anyway. When a function is so essential that evolution will build elaborate compromises rather than abandon it, you know you are looking at something non-negotiable. So what is it doing? What could possibly be worth the price of a third of a life spent helpless in the dark? For most of human history, we had no idea. Sleep looked like nothing, an absence, a switching off, the body simply idling until morning. It seemed obvious that the point of sleep was rest, that the body needed to stop and recover, and that the mind, having nothing to do, simply went dark along with it. This turns out to be almost entirely wrong. The sleeping brain is not idling. In some stages it is more active than during waking life, burning energy, firing in coordinated waves, doing work that cannot be done any other way. Sleep is not the absence of activity, it is a different kind of activity, an entire second life your brain leads, while you are not there to see it, in which it cleans itself, repairs itself, sorts and files the day, strengthens what matters and discards what does not, and rehearses, in the strange theatre of dreams, the emotions and dangers of your waking life. You spend a third of your existence in this other state, and you remember almost none of it. The scale of that is worth stating plainly. If you live to 80, you will have spent something like 26 years asleep. 26 years. More time than most people spend working, more than they spend with their children, more than almost any other activity of a human life. A quarter century of your existence, passed in a state you cannot remember and do not experience as passing at all. And for most of history, we assumed those years were simply lost, dead time, the price of having a body that tires. We now know they are nothing of the kind. Those 26 years are doing work, without which the other 54 would be impossible. Consolidating everything you learn, clearing the brain of the debris of thought, regulating the emotions you carry, repairing the body, sustaining the immune system, keeping the mind coherent. They are not lost years, but the hidden foundation of the waking ones. You spend a third of your existence in this other state, and you remember almost none of it, and yet everything you are in the other 2/3 depends upon it. This is the story of what happens in those hours, why they are necessary, and what the traditions understood about the nightly surrender long before any of it could be measured. So let us begin with what happens when you lie down and disappear. And before the disappearance itself, there is the machinery that decides when it happens. Deep in the brain sits a tiny cluster of cells that functions as a master clock, keeping a rhythm of roughly 24 hours, synchronized each day by the light that reaches your eyes. This clock governs not only when you feel sleepy, but a vast range of bodily functions, body temperature, hormone release, digestion, alertness, all rising and falling on a daily cycle you never consciously notice. As evening comes and the light dims, the clock triggers the release of a hormone that signals the body that night has arrived and sleep should follow. Alongside this clock runs a second system, a kind of pressure that builds the longer you stay awake, a chemical signal accumulating in the brain through the waking hours and making you progressively sleepier, then clearing away during sleep. The interaction of these two systems, the clock saying when and the pressure saying how much, determines when and how deeply you sleep. This is why fighting your body's timing is so costly, why shift work and jet lag and late screens disrupt sleep so badly. They set the clock against the pressure, demanding sleep when the body says it is day, or wakefulness when the body says it is night. You are not free to sleep whenever you choose. You are running on a clock older than your species, tuned to a turning planet. This matters enormously in our own time, because we have done something unprecedented to that ancient clock. For all of human history, until very recently, the day ended when the light did. Darkness fell, and with it came sleep. The body's clock aligned with the sun, as it had been for every generation of our ancestors and every species before us. Then came artificial light, and then the electric bulb, and then screens held inches from our eyes, pouring light of exactly the kind that most powerfully tells the brain it is still day. We now routinely delay our own clocks by hours, tricking the ancient machinery into thinking the sun has not set, suppressing the hormone that would tell the body night has come, and then demanding that sleep arrive on command anyway. We wake to alarms rather than to the natural completion of the sleep cycle, cutting the program short. We work through the night in shifts the body was never built for. The result is a species in a state of chronic, self-inflicted sleep disruption, unlike anything in our evolutionary history. And we are only beginning to reckon with the consequences. You are running on a clock older than your species, tuned to a turning planet, and much of modern life is a sustained argument with it, that the clock cannot win, but that we cannot afford to lose. So let us begin with what happens when you lie down and disappear. Begin with the shape of a night, because sleep is not one thing but a structured sequence, an architecture that repeats through the dark. When you fall asleep, you do not simply switch off, you descend through stages into progressively deeper states. In the first light stage, you drift at the border, easily woken, sometimes not even sure you were asleep. Then you go deeper, the brain waves slowing and swelling, into what is called slow wave sleep or deep sleep, the most profound state of the night, where the brain's electrical activity rolls in great slow waves, where you are hardest to wake, where if roused, you emerge confused and groggy, not knowing where you are. Deep sleep is worth pausing on, because it is the strangest state of all, stranger in some ways than dreaming. In the deepest stage, the brain's activity synchronizes into vast slow waves, millions of neurons falling into a coordinated rhythm, rising and falling together like a tide. Consciousness, as far as anyone can tell, is essentially absent. A person woken from deep sleep reports no dream, no experience, nothing at all. Only a bewildered blankness and the sense that time has vanished. This is the closest thing to genuine non-existence that a living person undergoes. Hours in which there was no one there, no experience, no self, no passage of time, and from which you emerge with nothing to report because nothing was reported to anyone. And you pass through this state every night, several times, and think nothing of it. It is also the state in which some of sleep's most vital physical work is done, as we will see, and it is the state that the body prioritizes most fiercely when sleep has been lost. The brain, given a chance to catch up, takes back its deep sleep first, as though this were the most essential thing it had been missing. And then, after some time in these depths, something remarkable happens. The brain rises back up, and instead of waking, it enters an entirely different state, in which the brain waves become fast and irregular, resembling waking activity. The eyes dart rapidly beneath the closed lids, and the body's muscles are almost completely paralyzed. This is rapid eye movement sleep, REM, the state in which most vivid dreaming happens, a state so distinct from the rest of sleep that some researchers have called it a third mode of existence. The paralysis deserves a moment of its own, because it is one of the strangest features of the night. During REM, the brain actively sends signals that switch off the body's major muscles, leaving you effectively immobilized, able to breathe and move your eyes, but almost nothing else. This is not an accident or a side effect. It is a deliberate mechanism, and its purpose seems clear. In REM, the brain is generating vivid experience, whole worlds, running, falling, fighting, fleeing, and without the paralysis the body would act these out. We know this because the mechanism can fail. There are people whose REM paralysis does not engage properly, and they physically enact their dreams, leaping from bed, striking out, running into walls, sometimes injuring themselves or their partners, all while asleep and dreaming. The paralysis exists to keep the dreamer still while the mind is elsewhere. Every night, your brain locks your body down so that you can safely go wherever it is dreams go, and occasionally the timing slips in the other direction, and a person wakes while the paralysis is still in force, conscious but unable to move, sometimes for terrifying seconds, a phenomenon known across cultures and mythologized in many of them, the sensation of waking into a body that will not obey. The machinery is precise and mostly reliable, but its rare failures reveal what it is doing every night without our knowledge. This cycle, down into deep sleep and up into REM, repeats through the night, roughly every 90 minutes, 4 or 5 times before morning, and the balance shifts as the night goes on. In the early cycles, deep slow-wave sleep dominates, the brain plunging into its deepest state, doing the work that only depth allows. In the later cycles, toward morning, REM takes over, the dreaming periods growing longer and more intense, so that most of your dreaming happens in the last hours before you wake. This structure is not arbitrary. It means that if you cut your sleep short, you do not simply lose a proportional slice of everything. You lose disproportionately the REM sleep of the early morning, the dreaming, the emotional processing that happens there. And if you fall asleep too late, you may lose the early deep sleep instead. The architecture matters, the sequence matters, and disrupting it damages functions that depend on getting the full night, in the right order. Sleep is not a quantity of unconsciousness, but a structured process, a program the brain runs. This is why the common modern habit of shortchanging sleep is more damaging than it feels. A person who sleeps 5 or 6 hours instead of 8 does not lose a quarter of each function. They lose most of the final REM-rich cycles entirely, cutting away the emotional processing and certain kinds of memory work that happen disproportionately in those last hours. And a person who sleeps in fragments, waking repeatedly, may spend 8 hours in bed and still be deprived, because the architecture never assembles, the deep stages never consolidate, the cycles never complete. Quantity is not the whole story. Structure and continuity matter enormously. This also explains why alcohol, which many people use to fall asleep, damages sleep so badly it can hasten unconsciousness while suppressing REM, producing hours of sleep that fail to deliver what sleep is for. You can lie unconscious all night and still be robbed of the sleep you needed if the program does not run properly. Sleep is not a quantity of unconsciousness, but a structured process, a program the brain runs, and interrupting the program has consequences that no amount of extra time in bed can fully repair. The clearest evidence of what sleep does comes from what happens when it is taken away. Sleep deprivation, even modest and short-term, degrades human function in ways that are well documented and alarming. Attention fragments, reaction time slows, judgment deteriorates, emotional control weakens, so that the sleep-deprived become irritable, volatile, prone to both anxiety and impulsivity. Memory suffers badly, both the ability to form new memories and to retrieve old ones. The immune system weakens. After enough sleeplessness, people begin to experience microsleeps, brief lapses of seconds in which the brain simply goes offline without the person noticing, which is why drowsy driving is so lethal. Push further, and hallucinations begin, the boundary between waking and dreaming eroding, the mind starting to dream while nominally awake. There is a reason sleep deprivation has been used as an instrument of torture and coercion, because it reliably breaks people, dismantling the mind's capacity to function, to resist, to remain itself. The connection between sleep and the health of the mind runs deeper than mere tiredness. Poor sleep is entangled with almost every psychiatric condition we know of, so consistently that researchers have increasingly come to suspect the relationship runs both ways, that disturbed sleep is not only a symptom of psychological distress, but a cause of it, a factor that can push a struggling mind further toward breakdown. Sleep loss amplifies emotional reactivity, weakening the brain's regulation of its own fear and distress circuits, so that the underslept feel more anxious, more overwhelmed, less able to hold their reactions in proportion. It degrades the capacity to see one's own situation clearly, to solve problems, to imagine that things might improve. Anyone who has lain awake at 3 a.m. knows that the mind at that hour, deprived of sleep and stripped of its defenses, produces a bleaker and more distorted picture of life than the same mind will produce after rest. This is not weakness, it is neurobiology, and it means that sleep, so easily sacrificed in a busy life, is among the most important supports of mental as well as physical health, one of the foundations without which a mind struggles to remain steady. The brain deprived of sleep does not simply become tired, it becomes progressively unable to be a mind. The numbers are sobering even at modest levels of loss. Studies have found that after roughly 17 to 19 hours without sleep, performance on tests of attention and reaction time can degrade to levels comparable to being legally intoxicated, and after longer deprivation, considerably worse. Yet the sleep-deprived person typically does not feel that impaired. One of the cruelest features of sleep loss is that it degrades our ability to judge how degraded we are, so that people drive, operate machinery, make consequential decisions, and perform surgery while functioning at a level they would never accept if they could perceive it accurately. Some of the worst industrial and transport disasters in modern history have involved crews working through the small hours of the night at the low point of the body's daily cycle with insufficient sleep behind them. Chronic partial sleep loss, the kind millions of people live with routinely, accumulates rather than resetting each day, so that a week of 6-hour nights can leave a person as impaired as one severe night of total deprivation without their ever noticing the decline. We are, as a species, chronically and dangerously underslept and largely unaware of it. The brain deprived of sleep does not simply become tired, it becomes progressively unable to be a mind, and worse, unable to notice that it has become so. And there is a rare and terrible disease that shows the end point. A hereditary condition, extraordinarily uncommon, attacks a specific region deep in the brain that is essential for initiating sleep. The people who inherit it begin, usually in middle age, to lose the ability to sleep. Not to sleep poorly, but to sleep at all. And once it begins, it does not stop. They suffer worsening insomnia, then complete sleeplessness, and as the months pass without sleep, they deteriorate, physically and mentally, through progressive dementia, hallucination, and physical collapse, until they die. There is no treatment. Sleeping pills do not help. The machinery that produces sleep has been destroyed. It is one of the most frightening diseases known, and it establishes, beyond any argument, that sleep is not optional. You cannot simply do without it. A human being who cannot sleep will die, and the dying takes months of a mind unravelling for want of the thing it surrenders to every night without a thought. Animal studies have made the same point with brutal clarity. Rats kept from sleeping die within weeks, and the manner of their dying is instructive. They do not simply collapse from exhaustion, but suffer systemic breakdown, their body temperature regulation failing, their metabolism running wild, their bodies deteriorating in ways that suggest sleep is doing essential physiological work throughout the organism, not merely resting the brain. This is one of the strongest clues we have to what sleep is for. It is not a passive pause, it is an active maintenance process, without which the body and brain progressively fail. And the failure is not slow decline into gentle sleepiness, but a genuine unravelling, systems losing their regulation one after another, as though the nightly repair had been keeping the whole machine coherent, and its absence lets the coherence come apart. Whatever sleep is doing, life depends on it absolutely, and the dependence is not a matter of comfort or preference, but of the most basic functioning of a living body. The traditions, long before any of this could be measured, treated sleep with a seriousness we have largely lost. They saw the nightly surrender for what it is, a kind of daily rehearsal of letting go, a giving up of control and consciousness that resembles, in ways they did not fail to notice, the greater surrender that awaits us all. Many traditions called sleep the little death, or spoke of the sleeper as one who tastes death each night and is returned. There are ancient prayers to be said before sleeping that commend the soul into divine hands for the night, on the recognition that to fall asleep is to entrust yourself to something beyond your control, with no guarantee of waking. Traditions across the world built rituals around the threshold of sleep, blessings for the night, protections against the dark, practices for the moment of letting go, treating the transition into unconsciousness as spiritually significant rather than merely biological. They understood something we tend to forget in our age of alarm clocks and screens, that every night we perform an act of profound trust, releasing our grip on ourselves and on the world, and that this daily surrender is worth noticing. And they sensed, too, that something happens in that other country, that the sleeping mind goes somewhere, does something, returns changed. The image of sleep as a small death runs remarkably wide. The Greeks made sleep and death brothers in their mythology, twin sons of night, the one a gentle rehearsal of the other. Jewish tradition holds prayers for waking that give thanks for the return of the soul, treating each morning as a small restoration of life that was, for the night, given back. Christian evening prayers place the sleeper in God's keeping through the dark, with an explicit awareness that the night's sleep might become the final one, and the great evening canticle of the Church has for centuries asked to depart in peace, a prayer for sleep and for death at once. In more than one tradition, going to sleep was to be accompanied by forgiveness, by setting right what could be set right, on the understanding that one should not enter the night with unfinished business, since the waking is not guaranteed. And the Hindu and other Indian traditions developed elaborate analyses of the states of consciousness, treating dreamless sleep as a distinct and profoundly significant state, one in which the ordinary self dissolves entirely and something deeper remains, a nightly return to a ground beneath the personality. These are not superstitions to be brushed aside. They are the fruit of people paying attention to something we pass through unthinkingly every night. They sensed that something happens in that other country, that the sleeping mind goes somewhere, does something, returns changed. So the picture we are left with, at the end of this first look, is a strange one. Sleep is not rest in any simple sense, not the body idling, not a gap in the day. It is a structured, active, non-negotiable process, ancient enough to be present near the origins of nervous systems, essential enough that evolution built extraordinary adaptations rather than abandon it, and vital enough that its absence kills. It costs an animal a third of its life and enormous vulnerability, and the cost is paid, universally, because whatever sleep does cannot be done any other way. We surrender consciousness every night, lie paralyzed in the dark, hallucinate for hours, and remember almost nothing, and this is not a flaw in our design, but among its deepest requirements. The traditions felt the weight of this nightly surrender and built prayers and rituals around it, sensing that something significant happens in those hours, that the sleeper goes somewhere and comes back, and the science, at last, is beginning to say what. Because the sleeping brain, far from doing nothing, is engaged in some of the most important work of your entire existence. Work that keeps your mind intact, your memories consolidated, your brain physically clean, and without which you would, in a matter of days, begin to come apart. So let us see what the science has found about those hidden hours, and what the sleeping brain is actually doing while you are not there to see it. Every night, while you are gone, your brain washes itself, not metaphorically. Physically, as you sink into the deepest stages of sleep, something extraordinary happens inside your skull. The cells of your brain shrink, opening up the spaces between them, and fluid begins to flow through those widened channels in pulsing waves, rinsing through the tissue, carrying away the molecular debris that has accumulated during the day. The brain, which has no room for such plumbing while you are awake and thinking, becomes, in sleep, a place where cleaning fluid can wash through, and among the waste it carries away are the very proteins that, when they build up, are found clumped in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease. Every night, in the hours you do not remember, a tide comes in and washes your brain clean, and then withdraws before you wake. It is one of the more startling discoveries of recent neuroscience, and it is happening inside your head roughly every night of your life, a hidden tide keeping the shore of your mind clear. You have never felt it, never known it was happening, but it happens tonight, and every night. It is worth pausing on how recently we learnt this. For most of the history of neuroscience, nobody knew the brain had such a system, and nobody thought to look, partly because it appears to operate, mainly during sleep, and studies of the brain were mostly done on brains that were awake or on tissue that was neither. The discovery, made in the last decade or so, changed how researchers think about what sleep is for, giving a concrete physical answer to a question that had been open for as long as the question had been asked. Sleep, it turns out, is partly a housekeeping operation, and one that cannot be skipped, because the housekeeping cannot be done while the house is in use. And that is only the beginning of what the night shift does. It happens tonight, and every night, and if it stopped, you would not last long. So sleep is not rest. That is the first thing to abandon. We speak of sleep as though the brain were an engine idling at the curb, waiting for morning, doing nothing much. But the brain in sleep is doing some of the hardest and most essential work of its entire existence. Work it cannot do while you are awake and using it. Work that must wait until you are out of the way. Think of a great museum or a busy station. During the day it is full of people, and almost no serious maintenance is possible. The floors cannot be resurfaced. The wiring cannot be replaced. The exhibits cannot be rearranged, because the crowds are there. Only at night, when the visitors are gone and the doors are locked, can the real work begin. The cleaning, the repairing, the reorganizing, all of it invisible to the people who return in the morning to find everything mysteriously in order. Your brain is like this. The waking hours belong to you. The night belongs to the maintenance crew. And what they do in those hours determines whether you will be able to think, remember, feel, and function when the doors open again. So what exactly is the night shift doing? What work is so essential that it is worth a third of your life and the danger of lying helpless in the dark to get it done? For a long time, this question had no good answer, and the absence of one was embarrassing for a science that could explain so much else about the body. We knew sleep was necessary because its absence killed, but we could not say what it was necessary for. Various theories came and went, that sleep conserved energy, that it kept animals safely still during dangerous hours, that it allowed the body to repair itself in some vague general way. None of these adequately explained why sleep should be so absolutely non-negotiable, why an animal would rather die than go without it, why the brain in particular should require it. The answers that have emerged in recent decades are far more specific and far more interesting. And they share a common shape. Sleep is when the brain does things to itself that it cannot do while operating. It is offline maintenance, and the offline part is not incidental, but essential. What work is so essential that it is worth a third of your life and the danger of lying, helpless, in the dark? The answer, it turns out, is quite a lot of work, and all of it critical. The answer, as far as we now understand it, has several parts, and each of them is remarkable. The brain cleans itself, physically flushing away the waste products of a day's thinking. It consolidates memory, taking the fragile traces of the day's experience and stabilizing them, moving them, weaving them into the vast web of what you already know. It prunes and strengthens the connections between neurons, keeping the whole system from saturating. And the body, meanwhile, repairs itself, releases the hormones of growth and healing, tunes the immune system, and does 100 other things that happen preferentially or exclusively at night. None of this can happen properly while you are awake. All of it is essential, and all of it happens in the dark, in your absence, while the person you are is temporarily nowhere. There is a theme running through all of it that is worth naming before we begin, because it explains why sleep must be sleep and not merely rest. Each of these labours requires the brain to be offline. The cleaning requires the tissue to relax and open, which it cannot do while thinking. The consolidation requires the brain to replay old patterns, which it cannot do while it is busy encoding new ones. The pruning requires a period when the connections are not in active use. In every case, the work conflicts with the work of being awake, and so the two must be separated in time. This is the deepest answer to why we sleep, and why we cannot simply rest instead, because the brain cannot be simultaneously a mind and a workshop, cannot both run the machinery of consciousness and perform maintenance on that machinery, and so it must alternate, giving the day to experience and the night to repair. Sleep is not the absence of work, it is the other half of the work, the half that requires your absence. So let us look at each of these hidden labours, beginning with the most surprising and the most recently discovered, the nightly washing of the brain. For a long time there was a puzzle in neuroscience that few people noticed. Every organ in the body needs a way to clear away waste, the byproducts of its own metabolism, and the body has an elaborate system for this. A network of vessels that drains fluid and debris from the tissues. But the brain seemed to lack it. The brain, which is the most metabolically demanding organ you have, burning enormous energy and therefore generating enormous waste, appeared to have no such drainage network at all. So how did it clean itself? The answer came from work led by the neuroscientist Maiken Nedergaard at the University of Rochester, who discovered a system that had been hiding in plain sight. She and her colleagues found that the fluid that surrounds the brain, the cerebrospinal fluid, flows into the brain tissue itself along channels that already had, running its cleaning channels along the outside of the blood vessels that already thread through every part of it. The vessels bring in the blood, the space around them carries in the cleansing fluid and carries out the waste, using the vascular tree as a scaffold. It is the kind of solution evolution favours, making double use of an existing structure rather than building a new one, and it is why the system escaped notice for so long. It is not a separate visible network, but a set of pathways defined by the spaces around vessels that were already well known. Once researchers thought to look for flow in those spaces and to look during sleep. The picture came into focus. It had gone largely unrecognised because it works, it turns out, mainly when we are asleep. That was the astonishing part. When Nedergaard's team examined this system in sleeping and waking animals, they found that its activity increased dramatically during sleep, the flow of cleansing fluid through the brain, rising to levels far above those of the waking state. And they found the mechanism. During sleep, the cells that make up the brain's supporting tissue shrink, and the space between the brain cells expands substantially, opening the channels wide enough for the fluid to course through. In the waking brain, those spaces are narrow and the flow is sluggish. In the sleeping brain, they open and the tide comes in. This is why the cleaning has to wait for sleep. The brain cannot be both fully operational and fully open for cleaning at the same time. The very architecture that lets it think efficiently while awake closes the channels that let it be washed. So the work must be done at night, in your absence, when the tissue can relax and let the fluid through. It is a striking piece of biological design. Later work suggested that the great slow waves of deep sleep may themselves help drive the flow, the coordinated rhythms of the sleeping brain, acting almost like a pump, pushing the fluid through the tissue in pulsing waves, synchronized with the brain's own electrical tides. Studies imaging the sleeping human brain have found waves of cerebrospinal fluid washing in and out in rhythm with the slow electrical waves of deep sleep, the fluids surging into the brain each time the neural activity dips. If this picture holds, then the deepest sleep, the state most devoid of experience, the closest thing to non-existence a living person undergoes, is precisely the state in which the brain is being most thoroughly rinsed. The very slowness and synchrony that make deep sleep so profoundly unconscious may be what drives the cleaning, which would mean that the emptiest hours of your life are the ones doing the most to keep your mind intact. There is something almost poetic in it. Though the biology is unsentimental, you must vacate the premises entirely for the deepest cleaning to happen, and the more completely you are gone, the more thoroughly the work gets done. It explains something we had never understood: why a brain that could not clean itself would need to shut down every single night to allow the cleaning to happen. What is being washed away matters enormously. Among the substances cleared more efficiently during sleep are certain proteins that accumulate as a byproduct of neural activity, including one called beta amyloid, which is the protein that forms the characteristic plaques found in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease. Studies have found that a single night of sleep deprivation can measurably raise the levels of this protein in the human brain, and that chronic poor sleep is associated with greater accumulation over time. This has led researchers to a sobering hypothesis that the long-term failure to sleep well may contribute to the build-up of the very proteins implicated in dementia, and that the relationship may run in a vicious circle since the disease itself disrupts sleep, which further impairs the clearance, which worsens the disease. Honesty requires marking the limits of what is established here. That sleep enhances the clearance of these proteins is well supported. That poor sleep contributes causally to Alzheimer's in humans is a serious and actively researched hypothesis not a settled fact, and the disease is complex, with many contributing factors. We should not overstate it. But the finding is significant enough, and the implication clear enough, that it has changed how many researchers think about the importance of sleep across a lifetime. The nightly washing may be, among other things, a defense of the mind against its own slow erosion, and the brain is not the only thing being repaired. Throughout the body, sleep is when a great deal of maintenance is scheduled. Growth hormone, which drives tissue repair and growth, is released in large pulses during deep sleep, which is why children and adolescents, who are building bodies, need so much more sleep than adults, and why the old saying that children grow in their sleep is closer to literally true than we assumed. The immune system does much of its work at night. Sleep affects the production and activity of the cells that fight infection, and studies have found that people who sleep poorly are measurably more likely to fall ill after exposure to a virus, and respond less well to vaccination. Metabolism and appetite regulation are strongly affected too. Sleep loss disturbs the hormones that signal hunger and fullness, pushing people toward eating more and toward the metabolic dysregulation that leads to weight gain and diabetes. The cardiovascular system, which runs at a lower and gentler intensity during much of sleep, appears to depend on that nightly dip. Chronic sleep loss is associated with elevated blood pressure and heart disease. The list goes on into nearly every system of the body. The nightly washing may be a defense of the mind against its own slow erosion, but sleep is doing this kind of restorative work everywhere. This explains something that has puzzled public health researchers: why poor sleep tracks with so many different diseases at once. If sleep were merely rest, you would expect its absence to make people tired, and no more. Instead, chronic sleep loss is associated with a strikingly broad range of harms across the body and mind, which makes sense only if sleep is doing many different essential things in many different systems. It is the night shift for the whole organism, not just the brain, and when the shift is cut short, maintenance goes undone everywhere at once, and the deficit accumulates. The common assumption that one can run a deficit through the week and repay it on the weekend does not hold up well. Some of what is lost appears to be genuinely lost, the maintenance not performed, the window closed. A person who sleeps too little for years is not simply carrying a debt they might one day settle. They are living with years of maintenance that never happened. This is one of the more sobering conclusions of modern sleep research, and one of the least heeded. Sleep is doing restorative work everywhere, in tissues and systems throughout the body, which is why its absence damages so much so quickly, and why the damage does not simply wash out with a long weekend. The second great labour of the sleeping brain concerns memory, and it is at least as remarkable as the cleaning. When you learn something during the day, the trace it leaves is initially fragile, held in a form that is easily lost. What sleep does is stabilize and transform these traces, a process called consolidation. During deep slow-wave sleep, the brain appears to replay the day's experiences, reactivating the same patterns of neural firing that occurred during the original event, but compressed, speeded up, run through again and again in the dark. Researchers have observed this directly in animals. A rat that has run a maze during the day will, during subsequent sleep, replay the same sequence of neural firing that mapped its path through the maze, as though rehearsing the route while unconscious. And this replay does not merely repeat the memory, it appears to move it, transferring the trace from the temporary storage of one brain region into the longer-term storage of the cortex, integrating the new information into the existing web of what you know. The day's experience is taken up, rehearsed, filed, and woven into the fabric of memory, all while you sleep. The electrical signatures of this process can be observed. During deep sleep, the brain produces brief bursts of rapid activity, known as sleep spindles, and the number and quality of these bursts correlates with how much a person consolidates what they learnt that day. There appears to be an intricate choreography at work, the slow waves of deep sleep providing the timing, the spindles and other rhythms carrying the replay. The whole system coordinated so that memory traces from the temporary store are broadcast to the cortex in precisely timed windows. Researchers have even been able to bias which memories get consolidated, playing a sound or a scent during learning, and then presenting the same cue quietly during deep sleep, which strengthens the specific memories associated with it. The sleeping brain, offered a reminder of a particular experience, appears to preferentially replay and consolidate that one. This is remarkable both as science and as a window into what the night is, not a blank, but a period of intense, organized, targeted work on the contents of your own mind, conducted according to a program you never see. The day's experience is taken up, rehearsed, filed, and woven into the fabric of memory, all while you sleep and know nothing of it. The practical consequences are considerable and well demonstrated. People who sleep after learning something remember it substantially better than people who stay awake for the same interval, and this holds for many kinds of learning, facts, skills, and procedures alike. A musician who practices a difficult passage and then sleeps will typically play it better the next morning, having improved without further practice, the skill consolidated overnight. Students who sacrifice sleep to study longer often perform worse than those who study less and sleep more, because the studying without the sleep fails to become durable memory. Sleep does not simply preserve what you learned, it appears to improve it, extracting patterns, finding connections, integrating the new with the old, and it is selective, seeming to preferentially consolidate what the brain has tagged as important. There is a further and stranger effect, which goes beyond preserving what you learned to finding things in it that you never noticed. Studies have found that sleep can produce genuine insight, the discovery of hidden patterns and shortcuts in material that a person had not consciously grasped while awake. In one well-known experiment, participants were taught a tedious procedure for transforming strings of numbers without being told that a hidden rule existed which would let them leap to the answer immediately. Those who slept between learning the task and returning to it were substantially more likely to discover the hidden rule than those who stayed awake for the same interval. Something in the night had found the pattern. This is consistent with what consolidation seems to involve, not merely storing the day's experience, but integrating it, cross-referencing it against everything else you know, extracting the regularities, finding the connections, and it fits the long anecdotal tradition of discoveries arriving in or after sleep, of problems solved overnight, of the advice to sleep on it before making a decision. The advice turns out to be sound. The sleeping brain works on your problems, sorts your material, finds patterns you missed, and hands the results back in the morning without any explanation of where they came from. Consolidation is selective, seeming to preferentially handle what the brain has tagged as important, and it is creative, finding structure that waking attention had missed entirely. The night is not a passive gap between days of learning, it is where the learning is actually completed. There is a third labour closely bound to this one, and it involves not building but pruning. Every day of waking life, as you learn and experience and attend, the connections between your neurons strengthen. That strengthening is what learning physically is, but this cannot continue indefinitely. A brain in which connections only ever grew stronger would eventually saturate. Every synapse maxed out, the whole system noisy and unable to encode anything new, like a page written over so many times that nothing can be read. Some researchers, notably Giulio Tononi and Chiara Cirelli at the University of Wisconsin, have proposed that one of sleep's central functions is to address this, that during sleep the brain scales down the strength of its connections broadly, weakening them across the board while preserving the relative differences between them. The strongest connections, the important learning, survive the downscaling, the weak, incidental connections fade away entirely. The result is a brain that has kept what mattered, discarded the noise, and restored its capacity to learn again the next day. On this view, sleep is not only where memory is consolidated, but where forgetting is performed, deliberately and usefully, clearing space by letting the trivial go. The night is where the learning is completed, and also where the unnecessary is quietly allowed to disappear. We tend to think of forgetting as pure loss, a failure of the machinery, but a brain that forgot nothing would be unusable. Every trivial detail of every day, every face glimpsed in a crowd, every meaningless number, every path not worth remembering, would be preserved with the same weight as the things that matter, and finding anything in that vast undifferentiated archive would become impossible. There have been rare individuals who forget almost nothing, who can recall the details of every day of their lives. And their accounts are not of a superpower, but of a burden, an inability to let the past recede, a mind cluttered with everything that ever happened to it. Useful memory requires forgetting. The signal only stands out because the noise has been allowed to fade. And sleep, on this understanding, is where much of that necessary forgetting is performed, quietly, selectively, sparing what matters and letting the rest dissolve. So the night does not only preserve, it also releases. Every morning you wake slightly lighter, having shed things you will never know you lost, and this shedding is as necessary to a working mind as the keeping. The night is where the learning is completed, and also where the unnecessary is quietly allowed to disappear. There is something almost unsettling in this, and the traditions, in their own way, sensed it. Every night, work of the deepest importance is done to you and within you, and you are not there for any of it. You cannot participate, cannot direct it, cannot even observe it. You can only make yourself available, lie down, let go, and trust that the work will be done. The traditions understood sleep as a nightly act of surrender for exactly this reason, a giving up of control that is not optional, in which we place ourselves in hands not our own. And they intuited, too, that the sleeper is not simply idle, but somewhere, doing something, being changed. Many traditions speak of the night as a time of hidden work, of grace operating while we cannot see, of restoration that comes not from our effort, but as a gift received in stillness. The image of the sleeper as one who is being tended, cared for, put right by something other than themselves, recurs across cultures. There is a particular theme worth drawing out, because the science gives it an unexpected literalness. Many traditions insist that rest is not merely permitted, but commanded, that the refusal to rest is itself a kind of error. The Jewish and Christian traditions built an entire institution around this, the Sabbath, a day of enforced ceasing, and its logic is instructive, that human beings are not machines, that endless productivity is a lie, that we must periodically stop and let ourselves be sustained by something other than our own effort. To keep a Sabbath is to declare that the world does not depend on your ceaseless labour, that you can lay down your work and the world will hold. And sleep is a nightly version of the same declaration. Every night, whether you like it or not, you are compelled to stop, to abandon your projects, to surrender your control of things, and to trust. Our culture, which prizes productivity above nearly everything and treats sleep as time stolen from achievement, has been arguing with this for a century, and losing. The traditions understood that the compulsion to rest is not an insult to human dignity, but a condition of it, and the science has now shown exactly what is lost when we refuse, not just alertness, but memory, health, sanity, and the physical integrity of the brain. The image of the sleeper as one who is tended and restored by something other than themselves recurs across cultures, in evening prayers that ask for protection and renewal through the dark, in the sense that morning brings a self-restored rather than merely rested. They could not have known about cerebrospinal fluid or memory replay, but they sensed that the night does something to us that we cannot do for ourselves, and that our part is only to let go and allow it, and they were right. So the night shift, seen whole, is astonishing. The brain is physically rinsed, its channels opening to let a tide of fluid carry away the day's molecular debris. The memories of the day are replayed, rehearsed, and moved into long-term storage, their patterns extracted, their connections found. The connections between neurons are scaled down so that the system does not saturate, the important preserved and the trivial released. The body releases its hormones of growth and repair, tunes its immune defenses, rests its heart, resets its metabolism. All of this happens in the dark, in the hours you cannot remember, to a body and a brain that have been temporarily vacated by the person who owns them. You are not present for any of it. You cannot help. You simply lie down, disappear, and are worked on. And in the morning you wake, restored by processes you will never witness, and go about your day as though nothing had happened. But we have not yet touched the strangest of the night's labours, the one that has puzzled and haunted human beings for as long as we have been human. Because you do not merely lie unconscious while all this happens. For a good part of the night, in the state where the brain runs hot and the body lies paralyzed. Something else is going on entirely. You dream. That is where we go next. Every night, for roughly 2 hours, you go completely insane. There is no gentler way to put it, and the comparison is not merely rhetorical. You see things that are not there and believe in them absolutely. You accept impossible events without question. The dead are alive. You can fly. This stranger is your mother. This room is also a beach. Your sense of time collapses. Your capacity for critical judgment vanishes almost entirely, so that the most absurd scenario is accepted as ordinary while you are inside it. You feel powerful emotions, terror, joy, grief, desire, in response to events that are not happening. And then you wake, and within minutes, almost all of it has evaporated, leaving only fragments, or nothing at all. If you experienced any of this while awake, it would be considered a serious medical emergency. Hallucinations, delusions, loss of insight, wild emotional swings. Amnesia. Every night, your brain produces a state that in waking life would be a psychiatric crisis, and it does this to every human being who has ever lived, and it does it at considerable cost. Generating a dream is not cheap. The brain in REM burns energy at rates comparable to waking, running its visual and emotional machinery at full throttle for hours. It also requires that elaborate safety mechanism, the paralysis, without which the dreamer would act out the dream and injure themselves. Evolution, in other words, has not merely tolerated dreaming, it has paid for it. In energy and in the engineering required to make it safe, and has preserved it across an enormous range of species. Other mammals show REM sleep, complete with the eye movements and the paralysis, and dogs twitching and running in their sleep are a familiar sight to anyone who has watched one dream. This is not a quirk of the human mind. It is an ancient and widespread feature of the sleeping brain, costly to produce, carefully protected, conserved across evolutionary time, which means, as with sleep itself, that it is probably doing something worth the cost. Why? What could possibly be worth this? This is the question that has haunted human beings for as long as we have been human. And it is worth being honest at the outset. We do not fully know the answer. Dreaming remains one of the genuinely open problems in neuroscience, but we know far more than we did, and what we have learned points in some remarkable directions. We know when dreams happen, and what the brain is doing while they do. We know which regions are running hot, and which are switched down. And the pattern explains a great deal about why dreams are the way they are, why they are so vivid and so emotional, and so utterly uncritical. And we have serious, evidence-based hypotheses about what dreaming is for, ideas that connect it to the processing of emotion, to the consolidation of memory, to the rehearsal of danger, to the creativity that has produced some of humanity's most important discoveries. None of these is proven beyond doubt, and we will mark clearly what is established and what is still hypothesis. It is worth knowing that the opposite view has been seriously held. Some researchers have argued that dreams are essentially meaningless, a byproduct of the brain's activity during REM, rather than a function in themselves. On one influential version of this, the forebrain is bombarded during REM by random signals arising from the brainstem, and dreams are simply the mind's attempt to weave a story out of this noise, the interpretation machinery, doing its best with nonsense input. On this account, dreams have no more purpose than the patterns in static, and the fact that they feel meaningful says more about our compulsion to find meaning than about the dreams themselves. This view was influential for decades and should not be dismissed. It may still capture part of the truth about how dream imagery is generated. But it has come under pressure as evidence has accumulated that REM sleep serves specific functions in emotion and memory, and that dream content is far less random than the theory implies, showing consistent patterns across people and cultures, and tracking closely with what is happening in the dreamer's waking life. The current balance of evidence leans away from pure noise, but the picture that emerges is not of a meaningless byproduct. It suggests that dreaming, strange as it is doing something for you, something the waking mind cannot do for itself, in the hours when you are not there to interfere. And it is worth stating clearly what this account is not. It is not an attempt to tell you what your particular dreams mean, to decode symbols, to read the future in them, or to treat them as messages from elsewhere. That is a different kind of claim, and not one the evidence supports. What the science can tell us is what the dreaming brain is physically doing, and what functions that activity appears to serve. This turns out to be strange and interesting enough on its own. And it has the advantage of being grounded in measurement rather than interpretation. The traditions, of course, had a great deal to say about dreams, and much of it is fascinating and worth hearing, and we will come to it. But let us first be clear-eyed about the biology. There is a middle position worth naming, between treating dreams as coded messages and dismissing them as noise. If the emotional processing hypothesis is broadly right, then your dreams are made from your own material, your concerns, your fears, your unresolved situations, worked over by a brain running without its critical faculties. That would mean dreams are not messages from outside, but they are also not random. They are about you, drawn from what is actually pressing on you, even when their surface is absurd. A person going through a difficult separation, who dreams repeatedly of losing things, searching for something that cannot be found, being unable to reach someone, is not receiving a coded telegram, but neither is the content a coincidence. The dream is built from what the mind is working on. This is why attending to your dreams can be genuinely informative, not because there is a fixed dictionary of symbols, but because the material of the dream tells you what your own brain is chewing on when the critic is off duty and the defenses are down. That is a modest claim, far short of prophecy, and it is roughly what the evidence supports. So let us first be clear-eyed about the biology, about the brain that generates these nightly hallucinations, and why it might be doing so. So let us go into the dreaming brain. Start with what the brain looks like while it dreams, because the pattern is extraordinary and it explains a great deal. When researchers scanned the brains of people in the state where most vivid dreaming occurs, they found not a quiet brain, but a highly active one, in some regions more active than during waking life. The visual areas fire intensely, generating the imagery of the dream. The regions involved in emotion, particularly the deep structures that process fear and reward, run hot, often more strongly than in waking. The areas involved in memory are active, pulling up fragments of experience. But one region is markedly switched down, the prefrontal cortex, particularly the parts responsible for logical reasoning, self-monitoring, critical judgment, and the sense of what is possible. The very part of the brain that would say, "Wait, this makes no sense," that would notice the impossibility, that would test the scene against reality, is largely offline. And this single fact explains almost everything about the character of dreams. Emotion is amplified, imagery is vivid, memory is scattered and freely recombined, and the critic, the fact-checker, the part of you that would object, has gone home for the night. You believe the dream because there is no one on duty to disbelieve it. There is a striking exception that proves the rule. Some people, sometimes, become aware within a dream that they are dreaming, a state called lucid dreaming, in which the dreamer knows the experience is not real and may even influence its course. Researchers have studied this by asking lucid dreamers to signal with prearranged eye movements when they become aware, since the eyes are not paralyzed during REM, and the signals do arrive from a person who is asleep and dreaming and simultaneously knows it. And when the brains of lucid dreamers are examined, the pattern shows partial reactivation of exactly the prefrontal regions that are normally switched down, the very regions responsible for self-awareness and critical judgment. When the critic comes partly back on duty, the dreamer recognizes the dream for what it is. This is powerful confirmation of the picture. Ordinary dreams are believed because the disbelieving machinery is offline, and when that machinery partially returns, so does the recognition that none of this is real. You believe the dream because there is no one on duty to disbelieve it, and on the rare nights when someone clocks back in, the belief dissolves. The same pattern explains other features of dreaming that have puzzled people forever. Why do dreams jump so freely between scenes, times, and people without transition? Because the machinery that maintains narrative coherence and tracks context is impaired, while the machinery that generates imagery and emotion is running freely. Why are dreams so often emotional and so often unpleasant? Because the emotional centers particularly those involved in fear and threat, are unusually active, so that the dream is generated in an emotionally charged state, and negative emotions appear in dreams more often than positive ones. Why do we forget dreams so quickly? Because the systems that form durable memories are operating differently during this state. The dream is experienced but poorly encoded, so that unless you wake directly from it and attend immediately, it dissolves within minutes. This is not mysterious once you know the neurobiology. The strangeness of dreams is exactly what you would predict from a brain running its visual and emotional systems at full power, while its critical and memory encoding systems are turned down. The forgetting deserves its own moment, because it is stranger than it seems. You dream for something like 2 hours every night, which over a lifetime amounts to years of vivid experience, and you retain almost none of it. Those years happened to you. You were there, feeling, seeing, terrified, or delighted, fully immersed. And they are gone, almost entirely, leaving perhaps a handful of dreams you remember from an entire life. It is as though a whole second existence runs alongside your waking one and is erased each morning. Whether this forgetting is a design feature or merely a side effect of the brain's state during REM is not settled. There is an argument that it might be useful. A mind that remembered its dreams as clearly as its waking life might struggle to tell them apart, might fill up with false memories of things that never happened, might lose its grip on which experiences were real. The forgetting may protect the integrity of your actual autobiography. Whatever the reason, the fact remains. You live a hidden life every night and lose it every morning, and the strangeness of dreams is exactly what you would predict from a brain running its visual and emotional systems at full power, while its critical and memory encoding systems are turned down. So much for how dreams are made. What are they for? The most compelling and best supported hypothesis concerns emotion. The idea, developed by researchers including Matthew Walker at the University of California, Berkeley, is that dreaming, particularly the REM sleep in which vivid dreaming occurs, serves to process the emotional content of our experiences, stripping the emotional charge from difficult memories while preserving the memories themselves. The mechanism proposed is striking. During REM sleep, the brain's levels of noradrenaline, a stress-related chemical, fall to their lowest point of the entire 24-hour cycle, essentially vanishing. This means that during REM, the brain is reactivating and replaying emotional experiences in a chemical environment free of the stress signal that accompanied them originally. The memory is being revisited without the alarm bells, and the proposal is that this allows the emotional sting to be gradually detached from the memory, so that over successive nights, you retain what happened but lose the acute distress of it. It has been called, aptly, a kind of overnight therapy. Think about what this would mean if it is right. A painful experience, at the moment it happens, comes bound to a physiological alarm, the racing heart, the flood of stress chemistry, the whole bodily state of distress. The memory is laid down with that alarm attached. And then, night after night, in the strange chemistry of REM sleep, the brain takes the memory out and looks at it again in a state where the alarm chemistry is absent. And gradually, over many nights, the memory and the alarm come apart. Eventually you can recall the event without the body reacting as though it were happening again. You remember what occurred, but it no longer detonates in you. This is, in effect, what good therapy tries to achieve deliberately, and the proposal is that the brain has been doing a version of it every night for as long as there have been dreaming animals. Time heals, we say, and we say it vaguely, as though the mere passage of days did the work. It may be that the nights do it, that healing happens not with time but with sleep. In the hours we do not remember, through a process running quietly beneath our awareness. It has been called, aptly, a kind of overnight therapy, the brain revisiting your difficult experiences again and again in a safe chemical space until you can remember them without being wounded by them. There is evidence supporting this. Studies have found that sleep, and REM sleep in particular, reduces the emotional reactivity to distressing images and experiences, so that after sleep, people respond less intensely to the same material. Sleep-deprived people show heightened emotional reactivity, their brain's fear centers firing more strongly, and with less regulation from the reasoning regions. And there are findings in people suffering from trauma that fit the picture uncomfortably well. In post-traumatic stress disorder, the recurring nightmares often fail to lose their emotional charge, replaying the trauma again and again without the usual decay of distress, and some researchers have proposed that this reflects a failure of the normal REM process. Perhaps because noradrenaline levels remain abnormally elevated during sleep in these patients, so the memory is replayed, but never stripped of its sting. A treatment that lowers noradrenaline has shown some benefit for these nightmares, which is at least consistent with the theory. We should be careful here. This remains an active area of research, not a closed case. And the emotional processing hypothesis, powerful as it is not universally accepted. But it is the most compelling functional account we have of why we dream. The picture also gives nightmares a place, which is worth having, because they are among the most distressing common experiences people have and are often treated as meaningless torment. On this account, an ordinary nightmare is not a malfunction, but the emotional processing system working on something difficult, running the frightening material through, perhaps not yet successfully, perhaps needing several passes. That does not make a nightmare pleasant, but it makes it intelligible, part of a process, rather than a random cruelty. And where nightmares become chronic and repetitive, as in trauma, the picture suggests something specific has gone wrong with the processing, rather than that the person is simply unlucky, which points toward treatments that target the mechanism. There are approaches, including a technique in which a person deliberately rewrites the ending of a recurring nightmare while awake and rehearses the new version, that have shown real benefit, and they make sense within this framework as ways of helping a stuck process move again. All of this remains an active field rather than a settled one, and we should not present hypotheses as conclusions, but it is the most compelling functional account we have of why we dream, and it makes sense of something everyone knows from experience, that a grief or a shock feels different after a few nights' sleep, that time and sleep together do something to the sharpness of pain. Anyone who has been through a serious loss knows this from the inside. In the first days, the memory of what happened is unbearable, so charged that the mind flinches from it, the body reacting as though the blow were landing again each time it comes to mind. And then, slowly, over weeks and months of nights, something changes. The memory does not fade. You remember exactly what happened, often in detail. But the charge attached to it diminishes, so that you can eventually hold the memory without being knocked down by it. People describe this as time doing its work, but the research suggests the work is done in the dark, night by night, in the strange chemistry of REM, the mind returning again and again to the difficult material until the alarm attached to it finally lets go. This would explain why sleep disturbance so often accompanies grief and trauma, and why it matters so much. The very process that would heal the wound is the one being disrupted, and it puts an unexpected weight on something we usually treat as trivial, that sleeping well after a loss is not merely comfort, but part of the healing itself. Time and sleep together do something to the sharpness of pain, and it may be that sleep does most of it. A second hypothesis, complementary rather than competing, concerns rehearsal. The Finnish researcher Antti Revonsuo proposed that dreaming evolved as a kind of simulator, a safe space in which to rehearse responses to threat. He noted that dream content is disproportionately negative and disproportionately concerned with danger, being chased, attacked, falling, losing something, failing at something crucial. Across cultures, these themes dominate, and he argued that this is not accidental but functional, that for our ancestors, a nightly rehearsal of threatening scenarios, running the emotional and motor responses to danger in a completely safe environment, would have conferred a real survival advantage, priming the brain to react effectively when the danger was real. On this view, the anxiety dream is not a malfunction, but a training exercise. Whether or not the evolutionary story is right, the observation about content is solid. Large collections of dream reports, gathered systematically across cultures and decades, show a remarkably consistent pattern. Negative emotions outnumber positive ones. Misfortune outnumbers good fortune. Aggression and being pursued or threatened appear far more often than their pleasant counterparts. Certain themes recur with striking universality: falling, being chased, being unable to move or run, arriving unprepared for an examination or a performance, losing teeth, being lost or unable to find the way. People who have never met, in cultures with nothing in common, dream the same handful of scenarios. This universality is one of the most robust findings about dream content, and it suggests something about dreaming that is built into the human brain rather than shaped by culture, and it fits uncomfortably well with the rehearsal idea. These are, almost without exception, dreams of vulnerability and threat, the very situations an animal would benefit from having practiced. It fits too with the emotional processing idea, since these are the situations most emotionally charged and most in need of diffusing. Dreams really are dominated by threat and difficulty, and this cries out for an explanation, whichever explanation eventually proves right. A related idea holds that dreams are involved in integrating new experience into the existing web of memory, testing connections, exploring associations, which would account for their bizarre juxtapositions, the brain trying out links between things that do not obviously belong together, most of which lead nowhere but some of which turn out to be valuable. And that last point connects to something well documented, the creative power of the dreaming and sleeping brain. The history of science and art contains a striking number of discoveries and works that arrived in or immediately after sleep. The chemist who reportedly grasped the ring structure of benzene after a reverie of a snake seizing its own tail. The physiologist who woke in the night with the design of the experiment that would demonstrate chemical neurotransmission scribbled it down, could not read his own writing in the morning, and was fortunate enough to have the dream again the following night. The composers and writers who have credited dreams with melodies and images and entire works. These anecdotes are suggestive rather than conclusive, but they fit the neurobiology, a brain that is freely associating. Unconstrained by the critical faculty that normally rejects unlikely connections, running combinations that waking logic would never permit, is exactly the kind of machine that might stumble onto a connection no orderly search would find. The dream's absurdity, on this view, is its creative advantage. Most of the combinations are nonsense. Occasionally one is a discovery. Research has begun to put some structure on this. Studies suggest that the sleeping brain, and REM sleep in particular, favours the discovery of remote associations, connections between things that are only distantly related, the kind of link that waking thought, which prefers the obvious and the well-worn path, tends not to make. Waking cognition is efficient precisely because it prunes the improbable. It goes straight to the likely answer and does not waste time on absurd combinations. But the improbable combination is exactly where originality lives. A mind that only ever takes the likely path will never find the unlikely connection that turns out to be true. And so there may be a genuine division of labour between waking and dreaming thought, the day for focused, logical, constrained problem-solving, the night for wild recombination, for throwing things together that have no business being together, most of it useless, occasionally striking gold. This may be why the advice to step away from a problem and sleep on it works so reliably, and why so many people report that solutions arrive not while grinding at a problem, but afterward, in the shower, on a walk, or on waking. The dreaming brain is running a search that waking logic would refuse to run. Most of the combinations are nonsense. Occasionally one is a discovery. The traditions, of course, took dreams enormously seriously, in ways that our own age has largely abandoned. Nearly every culture we know of treated dreams as significant, as bearing meaning, as worth attending to and interpreting. Sacred texts across traditions record dreams as vehicles of guidance, of warning, of revelation. Temples were built where people would sleep in order to receive healing dreams. Elaborate systems of dream interpretation were developed and refined over centuries. Kings consulted dream interpreters, and communities made decisions based on what someone had seen in the night. This universality is striking and demands some account. Why would every human culture independently arrive at the conviction that dreams matter? Part of the answer may simply be that dreams are vivid, emotionally charged experiences that feel like they come from somewhere other than ourselves, and human beings naturally seek meaning in such experiences. But the traditions also notice things the science is now recovering. The examples are everywhere once you look. The Hebrew scriptures are full of consequential dreams. A young man interprets the dreams of a king and saves a nation from famine. A fugitive sleeps with a stone for a pillow and dreams of a ladder reaching to heaven. The Christian Gospels have a carpenter guided by dreams at every crisis of a young family's survival. The Greeks built temples where the sick would sleep in sacred precincts, hoping for a healing dream from the god of medicine, a practice that continued for centuries and that people evidently found effective enough to keep traveling great distances for. The Buddhist tradition preserves accounts of significant dreams around the birth of its founder and developed, in some of its branches, elaborate practices of dream yoga, recognition that dreams process what troubles us, that they can present a problem in a new light, that a person may wake changed by a dream, that the night's work reaches parts of us the daylight mind cannot touch. They spoke of this in the language of spirits and gods and souls travelling. We speak of it in the language of noradrenaline and memory consolidation. But both are trying to account for the same undeniable fact that something happens in dreams, that it matters, and that we wake from the night's strange theatre somehow different from the person who lay down. So we can say this much, honestly, about why we dream. The mechanism is understood in outline, a brain running its imagery and emotion at full power while its critic sleeps, producing vivid, uncritical, emotionally charged experience that is poorly encoded and mostly lost. The function is less certain, but the best evidence points toward emotional processing, the nightly diffusing of difficult experience, toward the integration and testing of memory, and, more speculatively, toward the rehearsal of threat. None of these is proven, and honest science says so. But together they suggest that dreaming, far from being noise, is one of the ways the mind takes care of itself, working over the raw material of a life in a state no waking mind can enter. And that leaves the last question, the one no amount of neurobiology can settle. We now know a great deal about what happens in those hours. We know the brain is washed, the memories filed, the emotions diffused, the connections pruned, the body repaired, the strange theatre of dreams played out and forgotten. We know that all of it is necessary, and that none of it can happen while we are present. But what does it mean to be a creature built this way, one that must vanish every night in order to continue existing, that must surrender consciousness to keep it, that spends a third of its life in a country it cannot remember? That is where we go finally, to what the traditions made of the nightly surrender and the dreams that come with it, and to what all of this means for the third of your life you will spend away. Sleep has been called the little death, and the phrase is older and more widespread than most people realize. The Greeks made sleep and death brothers, twin sons of night, born together, alike in nature, the one a nightly rehearsal of the other. Across the world, in cultures with no contact between them, human beings looked at the sleeper, unconscious, still, unresponsive, breathing slowly in the dark, and saw the same thing. This is what death looks like, and they drew the obvious conclusion that every night we practice dying, that every morning we are, in a small way, raised. This is not a morbid thought, or it need not be. It is an observation, and an accurate one. From the outside, a sleeping body and a newly dead one are difficult to tell apart, which is why the comparison occurred to everyone, and why, before modern medicine, the fear of being buried alive was not irrational. Each night, you lay down the one thing you cannot bear to lose, your own conscious presence, and you let it go without knowing whether it will return. You have no guarantee. Thousands of people every night lie down and do not wake, and none of them expected to be among them. The Greeks personified the two as hypnos and thanatos, sleep and death, and told of them as brothers dwelling together in the underworld, one gentle and one final, both children of night. In their art, the two are sometimes shown carrying a fallen warrior together, one at the head and one at the feet, bearing him away. And the image is precise. These are the two who take you out of the daylight world, differing in whether they bring you back. Poets across languages have reached for the same pairing, calling sleep death's counterfeit, death's image, death's younger sibling. This was not merely a literary flourish. It reflected a universal observation that anyone could confirm at any bedside, and it gave human beings a way of thinking about the greater loss, by way of the smaller one they underwent every night and survived. If you want to know what dying looks like from the outside, they seem to be saying, look at someone sleeping. And if you want to practice for it, you are given the opportunity nightly, whether or not you take it. So what did human beings make of this, before the science, when all they had was the fact of the nightly vanishing and the strange country of dreams. They had no instruments, no way to record a brainwave or trace a molecule of waste being carried out of brain tissue. What they had was attention, generation after generation of it, paid to something that happened to everyone every night and that mattered enough to think about carefully. And what they built out of that attention is worth hearing, because they were noticing things we now pass through with our phones in our hands. They noticed the resemblance to death and built practices around it. They noticed that sleep is a surrender of control and made it a spiritual discipline. They noticed that the sleeper is restored by something they did not do themselves and drew conclusions about dependence. They noticed that dreams come from somewhere the daylight mind cannot reach and treated them as significant. And beneath all of it lies a recognition our own age has largely lost, that the nightly disappearance is not a trivial biological necessity to be minimized and optimized, but one of the most revealing facts about what kind of creature a human being is. We have lost the habit of noticing this, and it is worth asking why. For most of human history, the resemblance between sleep and death was unavoidable. People slept in the same rooms as their families and saw the sleeping bodies of those they loved. They sat with the dying and observed how similar the two states appear from outside. The stillness, the closed eyes, the slow breath, the unresponsiveness that deepens until it does not lift. The comparison was not a poetic conceit, but a plain observation anyone could make. And so it entered the language, the prayers, the mythology, the practices of dying, across cultures that had nothing else in common. Now we sleep behind closed doors, we rarely see the dying, and we have arranged our lives so that neither state is much observed. The resemblance has faded from our awareness, not because it stopped being true, but because we stopped looking, which is a loss, because what the traditions built on that observation turns out to be useful, whatever one believes about souls and afterlives. So let us hear what they said. The identification of sleep with death runs deep and shapes some of the most beautiful practices the traditions produced. Jewish tradition includes a prayer said upon waking that thanks God for the restoration of the soul, on the understanding that in sleep the soul is in some sense given back and then returned in the morning, so that each waking is a small resurrection and each new day a gift restored rather than a possession retained. There is a corresponding practice at night, a bedtime recitation that entrusts the spirit into God's hand for the hours of darkness, using words that a dying man would later speak from a cross. The pairing is deliberate and ancient. The same formula serves for going to sleep and for dying, because the traditions saw them as the same gesture at different scales. Christian evening prayer developed this with great richness in the office of Compline, the last prayer of the day, which asks for protection through the night, with an explicit awareness that this night might be the last, and which for centuries has closed with a canticle asking to depart in peace, a prayer for sleep and for death spoken in a single breath. The monastic traditions were especially precise about this. Monks were instructed to go to sleep as though they might not wake, which meant settling accounts before the night, forgiving what needed forgiving, seeking forgiveness where it was owed, letting go of the day's grievances, entering the darkness unburdened. There was a practical logic here as well as a spiritual one, since a mind full of unfinished conflict sleeps badly, but the reasoning went deeper than sleep hygiene. The point was formation. Some traditions built this into a nightly discipline with real structure, a review of the day before sleep, running back over its hours, noticing where one had acted well and where badly, giving thanks for what was good, and letting go of what could not be changed, and settling any grievance that might otherwise be carried into the dark. The Stoic philosophers practiced a version of this, examining the day each night before sleep, and the Christian monastic tradition developed it into a formal examination of conscience performed at the close of the day. There is an old counsel, echoed in more than one tradition, not to let the sun go down on your anger, which is at once a moral instruction and a piece of remarkably sound sleep advice. Modern research would support the practical half of it without hesitation. A mind still churning with unresolved conflict sleeps badly, and the hours before bed spent in agitation are hours that will be paid for in the quality of the night. The traditions arrived at the same conclusion by a different route, on the reasoning that one should be able to die at any moment without unfinished business, and that the nightly descent into unconsciousness is exactly the moment to be ready. The point was formation. A person who can lie down each night in peace, having made things right, is a person being trained in the art of dying well, practicing nightly the composure they will need once. And the practice ran the other way too. The fact that one might not wake was held before the mind not to frighten, but to concentrate, to make the ordinary evening a small examination of a life, so that no day ended with what mattered left unsaid. The Islamic tradition holds a similar parallel explicitly, teaching that God takes the souls at the time of their death, and also those that have not died, during their sleep, keeping some and returning others until an appointed time. The nightly and the final surrender are described in the same breath, one as the small case of the other. The Hindu traditions approach the states of consciousness analytically, distinguishing waking, dreaming, and dreamless sleep as genuinely different conditions of the self, and treating the third, in which the ordinary personality dissolves entirely and no experience remains, as a nightly return to a ground beneath the individual mind, worthy of the most careful philosophical attention. That we pass through this state every night without noticing struck these thinkers as remarkable. Their reasoning about dreamless sleep is worth following because it is careful and strange. In that state, they observed, there is no experience of any kind, no objects, no thoughts, no sense of being anyone in particular, and no passage of time. And yet, they noted, a person emerging from it does not report having ceased to exist. They report having slept well, which is a curious thing to be able to say about a period in which nothing whatever was experienced. Something, the argument runs, must have been present to make that report possible, some continuity beneath the vanished personality. Whether this reasoning is sound is a real philosophical question, and one can raise objections to it. But the observation it starts from is undeniable, and mostly unnoticed by the rest of us, that every night we enter a state in which the self we take ourselves to be is completely absent, and every morning we resume as though nothing had happened. These thinkers made dreamless sleep a central subject of inquiry, rather than a blank to be skipped over. And in doing so they were paying attention to something the rest of the world has largely ignored, that something remains when the personality dissolves became one of their central questions, and it is a better question than most of us have ever thought to ask. And the Tibetan tradition developed the parallel with a precision unmatched anywhere, teaching that the dissolution of consciousness at the onset of sleep resembles, stage by stage, the dissolution at death, so that learning to remain aware through the transition into sleep is direct preparation for remaining aware through the transition of dying. Their dream practices, accordingly, were not entertainment but rehearsal, using the nightly little death as a laboratory for the Great One. A practitioner who could remain lucid and unafraid as the world dissolved at the edge of sleep was, on this understanding, practicing exactly the composure they hoped to bring to the dissolution that comes once and does not reverse. The nightly transition, which the rest of us pass through unconscious and unnoticing, became for them a training ground, available every single night, free and universally provided. Across these traditions, whatever their disagreements about what survives and what does not, runs a common recognition. The nightly loss of consciousness is a rehearsal for the final one. A person who learns to surrender well each night may be better prepared for the surrender that comes once. And both surrenders are best made with a mind at peace, which is something that can be practiced. Picture what that practice actually asks. Ordinarily, the moment of falling asleep is one no one witnesses, including the person it happens to. There is being awake, then there is nothing, and the crossing itself is never observed. The instruction in these traditions is to try to stay present through it, to watch the world dissolve, to notice the loosening of the senses and the fading of the body's boundaries, without either clutching at wakefulness or being swept unconscious. It is extraordinarily difficult, which is why it takes years of training, and most attempts end simply in falling asleep as usual. But the aim is clear and the logic is coherent. If the dissolution at death resembles the dissolution at sleep, then someone who has learned to meet the small one with calm awareness has genuinely practiced for the large one. Whatever one thinks of the metaphysics behind it, the seriousness is striking. Here were people who looked at the most ordinary event of human life, falling asleep, and saw in it a training opportunity available every night for a lifetime, and organized their practice around it. Both surrenders they held, are best made with a mind at peace, which is something that can be practiced. There is a second theme, closely bound to the first, and it concerns control. You cannot force yourself to sleep. This is one of sleep's most maddening features, familiar to anyone who has lain awake watching the hours pass. Nearly every other bodily function can be commanded to some degree. You can hold your breath, tense a muscle, force yourself to stand and move, but sleep cannot be seized. It comes only when you stop trying, and trying is precisely what prevents it. The harder you pursue it, the further it recedes, because the effort itself is a form of wakefulness. Sleep must be allowed rather than achieved, received rather than taken. And this makes it a nightly lesson, in the limits of the will, an encounter with something absolutely essential to your survival, that your will cannot deliver. The cruelty of this trap is well recognized in the treatment of insomnia. The person who cannot sleep begins to worry about not sleeping, and the worry produces exactly the arousal that prevents sleep, so that the fear of sleeplessness becomes its own cause. The more desperately sleep is wanted, the more effortfully it is pursued, and the more effort is applied, the more thoroughly it is driven away. Effective treatments often work by attacking this loop rather than by pursuing sleep directly, teaching the person to stop trying, to get out of bed rather than lie there straining, to break the association between the bed and the struggle. The counterintuitive instruction is to give up the pursuit, because the pursuit is the problem. There is a lesson here that extends well beyond insomnia, and the traditions saw it clearly, that certain of the most important things cannot be obtained by effort, that some goods can only be received, and that the reflex to grasp harder, which serves us so well elsewhere, is precisely what forecloses them. This is why so many traditions surrounded the threshold of sleep with prayer, and why the content of those prayers is so consistent across cultures that had no contact with one another. They are prayers of handing over. Into your hands I commend my spirit. Keep watch with those who work or watch or weep this night. Guard us while we sleep. The structure is always the same. I am about to become helpless. I cannot protect myself. I place myself in keeping that is not my own. Whatever one believes about who or what receives such a prayer, the psychological wisdom in it is considerable, because it addresses exactly what the nightly surrender requires: the release of vigilance, the acceptance of not being in control. A person who can genuinely hand over their watchfulness can sleep. A person who cannot, and our own age, which prizes control and self-management above almost everything, which treats every part of life as something to be optimized and mastered, has produced an epidemic of insomnia that is at least partly a crisis of not knowing how to let go. We have built a culture superbly equipped to seize things and largely unable to receive them. There is something worth noticing in the specific content of these night prayers, which is remarkably consistent across traditions. They ask for protection, they name the vulnerability of the sleeper, and they often ask specifically on behalf of others who will be awake and suffering through the night: the sick, the frightened, those who watch and weep. The one about to become helpless prays for the others who are helpless. This is a strange and beautiful reflex, and it points to something the traditions understood about the night: that darkness is when human beings are most exposed and most alone, and that the appropriate response to one's own vulnerability is to remember everyone else's. Even the specific rhythm of these prayers, slow and repetitive and unhurried, is well suited to what they precede, since a mind slowing itself deliberately is a mind preparing to let go. Whether or not one prays, the shape of the practice fits the requirement exactly. Acknowledge the helplessness, release the vigilance, turn the attention outward, and then let it dissolve. We have built a culture superbly equipped to seize things, and largely unable to receive them, and sleep is the thing that can only be received. There is a third theme, and it concerns rest itself, which more than one tradition treated not as a permission, but as a command. The Jewish and Christian traditions built an entire institution around this in the Sabbath, a day of enforced ceasing. And its logic is instructive. To keep a Sabbath is to declare that human beings are not machines, that endless productivity is a lie, that the world does not depend on your ceaseless labor, that you can lay down your work and things will hold without you. It is a weekly refusal of the belief that we sustain ourselves by our own effort. And sleep is a nightly version of the same declaration, except that it is not optional. Every night, whether you approve or not, you are compelled to stop, to abandon your projects, to surrender your management of things, and to trust. Our culture, which treats sleep as time stolen from achievement and the first expense to cut when time runs short, has been arguing with this for a century and losing. The traditions understood that the compulsion to rest is not an insult to human dignity, but a condition of it. The science has now shown exactly what is lost when we refuse. The Taoist traditions of China came at rest from a different angle and arrived at something kindred. They prized what they called non-action, a way of proceeding that does not force or strain against the grain of things, and held that the sage accomplishes much precisely by not grasping, by yielding where yielding is called for, by allowing rather than compelling. Water was their favourite image, the softest thing, which yields to everything and wears away stone. It is not hard to see how sleep fits this vision, the one activity that cannot be forced, that comes only to those who stop striving for it, that is accomplished entirely by ceasing to accomplish. A tradition that made non-forcing its central principle would find in the nightly surrender a perfect illustration, and the nightly failure of the anxious to obtain by effort what comes freely to the unstriving is exactly the kind of paradox those texts delight in. Across these very different traditions, from the commanded rest of the Sabbath to the effortless action of the Taoists, runs the recognition that human beings are not sustained by their own exertion alone, and that there is a kind of good that only arrives when we stop trying to seize it. The science has now shown exactly what is lost when we refuse to stop, not merely alertness, but memory, health, emotional stability, and the physical integrity of the brain itself. And then there are the dreams. Every tradition took them seriously. The modern West is unusual in largely dismissing them. Ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian cultures kept dream manuals and employed professional interpreters. The Greeks built temples where the sick would sleep in sacred precincts, hoping for a healing dream from the god of medicine. The practice had a name and a procedure. The sick person would undergo purification and offerings, then sleep in a designated hall within the sanctuary, and hope for a dream in which the god appeared, either healing them directly or prescribing a remedy to be followed on waking. The temples kept records of cures, inscribed on stone for other pilgrims to read, and the sanctuaries operated for centuries and drew people from across the ancient world. Whatever was actually happening in those halls, and there are perfectly natural explanations involving rest, expectation, ritual, and the powerful effects of belief on symptoms, the institution testifies to something, that an entire civilization organized medical practice around the conviction that the sleeping mind could deliver what the waking one could not. They were, in a sense, prescribing sleep, and prescribing it as the setting for something that would happen to the patient, rather than something the patient would do. The scale and duration of the practice make it hard to dismiss as mere superstition. People evidently found it effective enough to travel great distances for generation after generation. The Hebrew scriptures are full of consequential dreams. A young man interprets the dreams of a king and saves a nation from famine. A fugitive sleeps with a stone for a pillow and dreams of a ladder reaching to heaven. The Christian Gospels have a carpenter guided by dreams at every crisis of a young family's survival. Buddhist tradition preserves accounts of significant dreams around the birth of its founder and developed, in some branches, elaborate practices of dream yoga. Indigenous traditions across the world treated dreams as a source of names, of vocations, of guidance, of contact with the ancestors. This is not a marginal phenomenon. It is one of the most widespread features of human religious and cultural life, and its universality demands an account. The honest account has two parts. The first is deflationary. Dreams are vivid, emotionally overwhelming experiences that arrive unbidden, that feel as though they come from outside the self, and that often concern precisely what most preoccupies us. It is entirely natural that human beings across all cultures would find such experiences significant and would seek meaning in them, and that they would explain their apparent externality by attributing them to gods, spirits, or ancestors. That does not make dreams messages. It makes them the kind of experience that human meaning-making inevitably reaches for. we should not mistake universality of interest for evidence of prophecy. The second part of the account is less deflationary, and it rescues something the modern dismissal misses. The traditions, wrong as they often were about specifics, were right that dreams reveal what is working in us beneath the daylight mind. Dreams are made from our own material, our own concerns and fears, and unfinished business, assembled by a process we do not direct. Attending to them can genuinely tell us what our own brain is chewing on, when the critic is off duty and the defences are down. This is worth stating carefully, because it sits between two errors. One error is to treat dreams as coded telegrams with fixed meanings, decodable by a dictionary of symbols. Predicting the future, or delivering instruction from beyond. The evidence does not support this. The other error is to dismiss dreams as meaningless noise, of no more interest than static. The evidence does not support that either, since dream content tracks closely with what is actually happening in the dreamer's waking life. The defensible middle position is that dreams are about you, drawn from what is genuinely pressing on you, even when their surface is absurd. A person going through a painful separation, who dreams repeatedly of searching for something that cannot be found, is not receiving a coded message, but neither is the content a coincidence. And the traditions grasped something further that is worth rescuing. A dream is not something you compose. It arrives, made of your own material, but assembled by a process you do not control. The traditions express this by saying, the dream comes from elsewhere, from the gods, from the ancestors, from beyond the self. The more modest modern version is that it comes from a part of you that does not answer to your conscious control, which is nearly as interesting and considerably easier to defend. Either way, the practical upshot is similar. Something in the night is working with material you did not consciously select, and what it produces may be worth attending to, not as prophecy, but as information about what you are actually carrying. People in grief dream of the dead. People under threat dream of danger. People with unfinished business dream of unfinished things, of doors that will not open, of journeys that cannot be completed, of the same conversation attempted again and again. This is neither mysterious nor meaningless. It is your own preoccupation, handed back to you in a form your daylight self did not compose and cannot edit, which is exactly what makes it capable of telling you something you did not already know you knew. It arrives, made of your own material, but assembled by a process you do not control, and it can therefore show you things your waking self, which is always managing its own self-image, would never volunteer. So this is what human beings made of the nightly disappearance, across thousands of years and every inhabited continent, before any of it could be measured. They saw in sleep a rehearsal of death, and built their practices of dying around it. They saw in the impossibility of forcing sleep a lesson in the limits of the will, and made the threshold of the night a place of handing over. They saw in the compulsion to rest a refutation of the belief that we sustain ourselves, and built weekly and nightly practices of ceasing. And they saw in dreams a message from a place the daylight mind cannot reach, and took them seriously in ways we largely no longer do. Much of what they concluded cannot be verified, and some of it is certainly wrong. But they were attending closely to something real, and attending to it for a very long time, and their practices, stripped of whatever metaphysics one does not share, turn out to be remarkably well fitted to the facts. A prayer of handing over at the threshold of sleep addresses precisely the psychological requirement of release that sleep demands. A nightly settling of accounts addresses precisely the agitation that keeps people awake. A ritual of thanks on waking addresses precisely the fact that something was given back that you did not produce and could not have seized. An attitude of treating dreams as worth attention addresses precisely the fact that they are made of your own unmanaged material. In each case, whatever the tradition believed about who receives the prayer or sends the dream, the practice fits the shape of what actually happens. This is not proof that they were right about the metaphysics, and we should not pretend it is. It is a demonstration that people attending closely to an experience over many centuries tend to develop practices that work, even when their explanations are of a different order than ours. The practices they developed fit the shape of what actually happens, with a precision that is hard to dismiss. Which leaves the final question, the one that gathers everything together. What do we make of all of it, the biology and the traditions alike? And what does it mean to be the kind of creature that must vanish every night in order to continue existing? That is where we go now, to the last and hardest reckoning. None of it means anything. That is the objection we have to face first, and it is a serious one. Sleep is a physiological process, no more spiritually significant than digestion. The brain needs to clear metabolic waste and consolidate memory. It does so in an offline state. That is the whole of it. To call sleep a little death, to speak of surrender and trust and grace and rehearsal, is to import poetry into plumbing, to make something profound out of something merely necessary. We do not write hymns about the kidneys. We do not build spiritual practices around the emptying of the bowels, which is also essential, also involuntary, also something the body does whether we approve or not. Why should the fact that the brain requires downtime become an occasion for existential reflection? The traditions, on this reading, were doing what human beings always do with anything they do not understand, filling the gap with meaning, dressing biology in borrowed robes, and mistaking their own poetry for insight. Now that we know what sleep is actually for, the poetry can be set aside. And there is a version of this objection that is even harder to dismiss, which points at the history of the thing. Every time human beings have not understood a bodily process, they have filled the gap with significance, and every time the science has arrived, the significance has evaporated. Disease was once moral, a matter of sin and divine displeasure. Now it is microbes and mutations. Madness was possession. Now it is neurochemistry and circuitry. Lightning was the anger of gods. Now it is potential difference. In each case, a natural phenomenon was invested with enormous meaning, precisely because it was mysterious, and in each case the meaning drained away as the mechanism came into focus. Sleep, on this reading, is simply the latest example, still mysterious enough that people can project significance onto it, and destined to be as thoroughly demystified as fever or eclipse. Give it another century of neuroscience, and no one will speak of the little death any more than they speak of the humours. This is a serious argument with an excellent track record behind it, and it should not be waved away. Now that we know what sleep is actually for, the objection concludes, the poetry can be set aside. This deserves a straight answer rather than a defensive one, and the straight answer is that the objection is half right, and that the half it gets wrong is the important half. The biological account is correct. Sleep does serve physiological functions, and those functions are now reasonably well understood, and nothing in the traditions adds to that understanding, or ever could. But whether the nightly loss of consciousness is significant for how we understand ourselves is a different question, and it is not one biology can answer, because it is not a question about mechanism. It is a question about meaning, and the facts are silent about meaning. This is not a dodge or a retreat into vagueness. It is a straightforward observation about what different kinds of question can settle. No measurement of the brain will ever deliver a verdict on whether the nightly loss of the self is worth reflecting on, in the same way that no measurement will tell you whether a piece of music is worth listening to. The measuring and the valuing are different operations, and confusing them is a mistake in both directions. The mystic who thinks a scan can confirm a spiritual claim, and the materialist who thinks a scan can refute one, are making the same error from opposite ends. They are the same facts for everyone. What we make of them is not given by the facts. The person who finds the nightly vanishing of the self worth reflecting on, and the person who finds it as unremarkable as digestion, are looking at identical evidence and responding differently, and neither response is dictated by the biology, so the objection cannot be answered by more science. It can only be answered by asking honestly what survives when you take the science seriously and grant the objection everything it is owed. So let us do that and see what is left standing. But the historical argument deserves a reply before we go on, because it proves less than it appears to. It is true that mechanistic explanation has repeatedly displaced supernatural ones, and that this pattern should make us cautious. But notice what actually happened in those cases. We did not discover that lightning is unremarkable. We discovered what it is, and it remains one of the more astonishing things that happens on this planet. We did not discover that disease is trivial. We discovered its causes, which turn out to involve a hidden world of organisms more strange than the demons they replaced. Explanation does not automatically deflate. Sometimes it relocates the wonder, moving it from a false place to a true one. What has genuinely been eliminated in those historical cases is a particular kind of claim that the phenomenon was a message or a punishment or an intervention, and those claims deserved elimination. What has not been eliminated is the phenomenon's capacity to astonish someone paying attention. So the fact that we now understand a good deal about sleep does not settle whether the nightly disappearance of the self is worth reflecting on. It only settles that certain explanations of it are wrong. So let us do that work, granting every objection its full weight, and see what is left standing. There is a second objection, sharper than the first, and it aims at the method rather than the conclusion. It runs like this: the parallels between the traditions and the science, which have appeared throughout this account, are being manufactured. The tradition said, sleep resembles death. The science says nothing of the kind, only that consciousness is temporarily absent. The tradition said the sleeper is tended and restored by something beyond themselves. The science says cerebrospinal fluid flows through widened extracellular spaces along the vasculature. To place these side by side and suggest they are describing the same thing is to blur a real distinction, taking a poetic intuition and a physical finding and pretending they converge when they merely coexist. Any two accounts of the same phenomenon will share some surface features that does not make one a confirmation of the other. This objection has real force, and it should be conceded generously rather than resisted. The traditions were not doing proto-neuroscience. The glymphatic system is not grace. Where the science and the traditions genuinely meet is narrower than it can be made to seem, and pretending otherwise would be exactly the intellectual dishonesty this whole account has tried to avoid. So let us mark the boundaries precisely. There are real overlaps of observation, and they are not trivial. Both the traditions and the science recognize that something essential happens during sleep that the sleeper does not perform. Both recognize that the sleeper is passive while being restored. Both recognize that the state resembles death from the outside. Both recognize that dreams draw on what troubles us. These are genuine convergences at the level of observation, and they are worth noting because they show that careful attention over centuries can arrive at accurate descriptions without any instruments. That is not a small thing, and it is worth respecting rather than patronizing. A tradition that concluded, purely from watching sleepers and dying people for a few thousand years, that the two states resemble one another, that the sleeper is restored without acting, and that dreams are made of our own troubles, got a good deal right about a phenomenon it had no means of investigating. The explanations they attached were of a different order and cannot be evaluated the same way. But the observations were sound. But the tradition's further claims that a soul is taken and returned, that the restoration is performed by a divine agent, that dreams carry messages from beyond, are not confirmed by the finding that the brain washes itself. Those claims stand or fall on other grounds entirely, and we will not smuggle them in on the back of a neuroscience result. What the traditions offer is not corroboration. It is something different, and in its own way, more useful, a way of holding a fact that the science establishes but cannot interpret. A third objection comes from a different direction entirely, and it says that all this reflection is beside the point. Sleep is a constraint to be managed, a biological inconvenience that we should be working to reduce, or eventually to engineer away. There are people seriously pursuing this, seeking pharmaceutical or technological means to cut the sleep requirement, on the reasoning that a third of a life is an enormous quantity of time to lose, and that recovering even part of it would be an extraordinary gain. Why romanticize a limitation we might one day overcome? Why write poetry about a bug we are trying to patch? This objection deserves a serious response, because it may well be right about the technical possibility. The history of medicine is full of limits that looked permanent until they were not. But it rests on an assumption worth examining, which is that the hours of sleep are subtracted from life, rather than being part of it. Everything we have seen suggests otherwise. Those hours are not a gap in living. They are when a great deal of the work of being a person is done, when the day is made into memory, when grief is diffused, when the connections are pruned, when the brain is physically cleaned, when the mind is kept coherent enough to be a mind. To call them lost is like calling a building's foundations wasted material because no one lives in them. And there is something worth noticing in the impulse itself. In a culture so committed to production, that it experiences a biological necessity shared by every animal on Earth as an insult, an inefficiency, a theft from the working day. That impulse may reveal more about us than about sleep. It is at least worth asking whether a civilization that regards a third of human life as an obstacle to be removed has understood what human life is for. The traditions, whatever else they got wrong, never made that particular mistake. And there is a practical argument against the optimizers that does not depend on any values at all. Even granting their premise that more waking hours would be better, the attempt to take them by cutting sleep does not work. The evidence on this is overwhelming and one-directional. Reduce sleep and you get more hours of a worse mind, hours in which attention fragments, judgment degrades, emotion runs unregulated, memory fails to consolidate, and the person becomes progressively less able to notice how impaired they have become. You do not gain time, you trade good hours for a larger number of bad ones, and the trade worsens the longer it continues. This is why the fantasy of the sleepless high performer is a fantasy. The people who genuinely function on very little sleep are rare enough to be studied as curiosities, carrying uncommon genetic variants, and almost everyone who believes themselves to be among them is simply impaired and unaware of it, which is one of the reliable effects of the impairment. Whatever one thinks about the meaning of sleep, the arithmetic of trying to skip it does not work out. The traditions, whatever else they got wrong, never made that particular mistake, and neither does the data. So what survives all three objections? A good deal, as it turns out, and none of it requires any metaphysics at all. These things are simply true. Whatever framework you bring to them, you will spend approximately a third of your life unconscious. During that time, work, surrender, and not return. Every one of these statements is a plain description of a human life, verifiable, uncontroversial, and true of every person who has ever lived or ever will. The traditions did not invent this strangeness. They noticed it, which is more than most of us manage, and noticing turns out to have consequences, which is the practical case for taking any of this seriously. A person who has genuinely registered that they will spend a third of their life unconscious, and that this third is not wasted but load-bearing, treats their sleep differently than a person who has not. A person who has registered that sleep cannot be seized, only allowed, approaches a sleepless night differently, with less of the desperate effort that guarantees failure. A person who has registered that they are rebuilt each night by processes they do not control holds their own competence a little more lightly, which is generally a good thing for a human being to do. And a person who has registered that the nightly letting go is something they have survived thousands of times may find the prospect of the final one slightly less unimaginable. None of this requires any particular belief. It requires only attention to what is already the case. The traditions noticed it, which is more than most of us manage, and they built practices around noticing it, which is more still, and the practices worked well enough to be transmitted for thousands of years. And there is one implication that deserves to be drawn out, because it is genuinely disorienting once you see it. Your continuous existence is not continuous. It is intermittent, punctuated nightly by absences in which no one is home. The self that plans and worries and holds everything together is set down each night and picked up again each morning, and the thread of your identity, which feels so solid and unbroken, is in fact stitched together across thousands of gaps. Philosophers have found this genuinely puzzling, and it is worth sitting with rather than brushing past. What makes the person who wakes tomorrow the same person who fell asleep tonight? Not continuity of consciousness, since that is precisely what was interrupted. Not continuity of matter, since the atoms of your body are being exchanged constantly. What connects them is memory and pattern. The one who wakes has the memories of the one who slept, the same dispositions, the same body carrying on the same habits, which means that the self is less a thing that persists and more a pattern that is reconstituted night after night from what was stored. And the reconstitution is not automatic or guaranteed. It depends on the very processes we have traced, the consolidation that preserves the memories, the maintenance that keeps the brain capable of running the pattern at all. You are, in a real sense, rebuilt each morning out of what was kept, and the keeping is done in the dark by machinery you never see. This is not cause for anxiety. The rebuilding has worked every morning of your life, and there is no reason to expect it to fail tomorrow. But it does mean that the solidity of the self is more of an achievement and less of a given than it feels, and that the achievement is accomplished nightly, in your absence, by a body that keeps you in being while you are not there to help. You do not maintain yourself, you are maintained and then handed back. This is worth staying with, because it cuts against something our culture holds very dear. We tell ourselves that we are self-made, autonomous in charge, the authors of our own continuation. And in the daylight hours, there is enough truth in this to sustain the illusion. We do make choices, exert effort, shape outcomes. But every night the illusion is suspended completely. For a third of every day, you are entirely dependent, doing nothing for yourself, sustained by processes you neither initiated nor understand, as helpless as an infant and as thoroughly cared for. This is not a failure of independence, it is the permanent condition, briefly made visible. The rest of the time, the dependence is disguised by activity, by the sensation of doing things. But it never actually goes away. Your heart beats without your permission. Your cells divide without your knowledge. Your brain maintains itself whether or not you approve. Sleep simply removes the disguise for a few hours each night. The traditions built their language of dependence and gift around exactly this, and one need not adopt their metaphysics to see that they were describing something true about the human situation. You do not maintain yourself. You are maintained, and then handed back, every morning of your life. This is the same threshold we have reached in every one of these inquiries. The place where the facts run out and the meaning begins. When we followed the last moments of a dying brain, we found the same structure, the science able to describe with growing precision what happens, and entirely silent on what it means. When we asked why pain exists, the biology explained the alarm, and had nothing whatever to say about the agony that exceeds it. When we traced the atoms of the body back to the first minutes of the universe, we found astonishing facts that refused to tell us how to feel about them. Here it is again. Science can tell you what the sleeping brain does. It cannot tell you what to make of being a creature that must vanish nightly in order to persist. There is a thread running through all of it. The universe is generous with facts and silent about their significance, and it will show you exactly how you are made, and then leave the question of what that is worth entirely to you. But notice something else about these inquiries taken together, because a pattern emerges that is worth naming. In each case, the closer we looked at something utterly ordinary, something we passed through daily without a second thought, the stranger it turned out to be. A tear, a breath, a moment of pain, a night's sleep. Look closely at any of them, and the ordinary dissolves into something remarkable. A body made of stellar debris, an alarm system 4 billion years in the making, a brain that flares as it dies, a self that is dismantled and rebuilt nightly. The strangeness was always there. We had simply stopped seeing it, worn smooth by familiarity. Perhaps that is the most reliable finding of all these investigations, that the extraordinary is not somewhere else, in exotic phenomena at the edges of physics, or in states available only to a few, but distributed through the most ordinary furniture of a human life, waiting in the things you do every day without noticing. The nightly disappearance is one more place where this becomes visible, and there may be a reason for this pattern, beyond coincidence. The things we do most often are precisely the things we stop seeing, because attention is expensive, and familiarity is its natural enemy. The brain is built to filter out the constant and notice the novel, which is why you do not feel your clothes against your skin, or hear the hum of a refrigerator until someone mentions it. This is efficient and mostly correct, but it has a cost. The most fundamental facts of your existence, the ones that repeat daily, are exactly the ones your attention has been trained to skip. You breathe about 20,000 times a day and notice almost none of it. You sleep every night of your life and have probably never once found it strange. The result is that a person can live an entire life without ever really looking at the conditions of their own existence, not because those conditions are hidden, but because they are too constant to register, which suggests that the useful move for anyone who wants to see clearly is not to search for extraordinary experiences, but to look hard at the ordinary ones. They are stranger than the exotic, and they are already yours. The nightly disappearance is one more place where this becomes visible if you are willing to look at it. so let it come home. Here is what your own life actually looks like, seen clearly. Every night, you stop existing for a while. Then it resumes, and you take up the same name and the same history, and carry on as though there had been no interruption. And you have done this so many thousands of times that you have stopped finding it remarkable. But it is remarkable, and it has a consequence worth taking seriously. It means you have already done, thousands of times, the thing you most fear. You have let go of consciousness. You have surrendered control completely. You have entrusted yourself to processes you cannot see and outcomes you cannot guarantee. Every night of your life, you have made a small version of the great surrender. This is what the traditions meant when they called sleep a rehearsal and treated it as preparation. Not that sleep proves anything about what death holds. It does not, and we should not claim it does. But that the capacity to let go, to release the grip, to stop managing and simply allow, is one you already possess and exercise nightly, without effort or ceremony. Whatever comes at the end will ask of you something you have, in a smaller way, done every night since you were born. And there is a corollary worth noticing. The people who struggle most with sleep are often precisely the people who struggle most with letting go generally. The vigilant, the anxious, the ones who cannot stop managing. Learning to release at the threshold of the night is therefore not merely a technique for better rest. It is practice in a capacity that serves a person in far more than sleeping. Every night of your life, you have made a small version of the great surrender, and every morning you have found that the letting go was survivable, was even necessary, was in fact the very thing that allowed you to continue. We should be careful with this, because it can be pushed too far into false comfort. Sleep is not death, and the fact that we wake from one says nothing whatever about whether anything follows the other. Anyone who argues that sleep proves the soul survives, because consciousness returns each morning, is arguing badly. Consciousness returns because the brain resumes, and that is precisely what will not happen in the other case. The parallel is real, but limited, and honesty requires holding it at its true size. What the parallel actually offers is not evidence, but familiarity, and familiarity is not nothing. It tells you that the losing of consciousness, considered simply as an experience, is not terrible. You have undergone it thousands of times and never once found it frightening from the inside, because there is no inside to it. The dread we feel about the loss of consciousness is felt in anticipation, by a mind imagining an absence it will not be present to experience. Sleep demonstrates this every night. The going is not painful. The being gone is nothing at all. This is a smaller consolation than an afterlife, and a more reliable one, because it rests on evidence everyone has. Much of the fear of death is really fear of two different things bundled together. The fear of dying, of the process, of pain and struggle, and the losing of everything, and the fear of being dead, of the absence itself, of not existing. The first fear is about something real, and the evidence about the end of life suggests it is often gentler than we imagine. The second fear is stranger, because it is fear of a state in which there is no one to suffer it, no experience of absence, no one left to miss anything. Sleep is our nightly demonstration of exactly this. In dreamless sleep there is no experience whatsoever, no passage of time, no self to notice its own absence, and you have never once, in all your thousands of nights, found that state distressing while you were in it, because there was no you in it to be distressed. Whatever else is uncertain, this much is testified to by every night of your life. Some ancient philosophers made precisely this argument about death, that where we are death is not, and where death is we are not, so that the feared thing is never actually encountered. Sleep is the everyday version of the same observation. The going is not painful. The being gone is nothing at all. There is a practical wisdom in all this that costs nothing to accept. Take your sleep seriously, in the ordinary sense first. The science is unambiguous that it is not optional and not a luxury, and our culture is dangerously wrong about this. Regularity matters enormously, because the ancient clock in your brain works best when the times of sleeping and waking are consistent and handles disruption badly. Light matters, because the clock is set by light, and hours of bright screens in the evening tell a very old system that the sun has not gone down. Darkness and cool and quiet help, because the body descends more readily in conditions resembling the ones it evolved in. and the pursuit of sleep defeats itself, so the approach is to create the conditions and then stop trying. None of this is exotic advice, and all of it is routinely ignored by people who would never ignore comparable advice about diet or exercise. There is a curious asymmetry in how we treat the three pillars of physical health. Food and movement have become subjects of enormous cultural attention, tracked and optimized and discussed endlessly. Sleep, which is at least as consequential and considerably harder to compensate for, is treated as the flexible one, the one that yields when something has to give. We treat sleep as the first expense to cut when time runs short, and we do this while the evidence accumulates that it is among the foundations of physical and mental health. A word is owed here to those for whom none of this is a matter of choice. There are people who would sleep if they could and cannot, those with genuine insomnia, with chronic pain, with the sleeplessness that comes with grief or anxiety or illness, with newborn children, with night shifts they cannot refuse, with the wakefulness that arrives at 3 a.m. and will not be reasoned with. For them, being told that sleep is essential is not helpful information, but another weight, since they know it already and are living the consequences. Nothing in this account should be heard as blame. The point is not that people who sleep badly have failed at something. It is that sleep matters enough to be worth protecting where it can be protected, and worth taking seriously as a medical matter where it cannot. Insomnia is treatable, often effectively, and the treatments that work best are usually not the ones people reach for first. If your nights are genuinely broken, that is worth pursuing as seriously as you would pursue a persistent pain, and the seriousness of the thing is the reason. We treat sleep as the first expense to cut when time runs short, and we do this while the evidence accumulates that it is among the foundations of physical and mental health. But take it seriously in the other sense too. Notice the threshold when you cross it. Let the last minutes of the day be a genuine setting down of the day's business, of the grievances, of the endless management. Since you are about to release all of it anyway, and will sleep better for having released it deliberately. The traditions counselled going to sleep at peace, having forgiven and been forgiven, having let the day go, and their reasons were spiritual, but the effect is practical. A mind that has genuinely set things down sleeps, and a mind still gripping does not. And when you wake, notice that too. You have been given back something you did not earn and could not have taken. The traditions called the morning a small resurrection and gave thanks for it. You need not use their language to notice the fact, or to conclude that a thing so important deserves better than the last exhausted scraps of your attention. Tonight you will lie down. The light will go out. Your body will grow heavy, and your thoughts will begin to lose their thread. And then, at a moment you will not perceive, and will never remember, you will be gone. Somewhere in the dark, the tide will come in and wash through the tissue of your brain, carrying away the residue of this day. The things you learnt today will be taken up, rehearsed, and woven into the fabric of everything you already know. The griefs you carry will be brought out and looked at again in a chemistry without alarm, and softened a little, as they have been softened night after night for as long as you have grieved. Your body will repair what the day damaged, and for a couple of hours you will live an entire other life, vivid and impossible and emotionally overwhelming, and lose almost all of it before morning. None of this requires anything from you. You will not supervise it, or assist it, or know that it happened. The most important maintenance of your existence will be performed on a body temporarily abandoned by its owner, and it will be finished before you return, and you will never see a trace of the work. Your only part is to lie down and let go, and in the morning you will return. The self will reassemble, the thread will pick up, and you will rise and remember your name and go on with your life, carrying no memory of the country you have just spent a third of your night in. This has happened to you thousands of times. It will happen thousands more, until the night it does not. That is not a threat, it is simply the shape of things, and the traditions were right, that a person who knows it lives more awake than a person who does not. So do not despise the nightly disappearance, and do not resent the hours it seems to take from you. Nothing is being stolen. The night is not the enemy of the day, it is what makes the day possible. And a life spent resenting a third of itself is a life at war with its own conditions. They are not a tax on living, they are part of the living, as much as the waking hours are, and arguably the part that makes the rest coherent. You are a creature that must vanish in order to continue, that must stop being someone in order to keep being someone, that is put back together each night by processes it will never witness. Lie down tonight and let it happen. Let go of the day and the grip and the self that has been holding everything together. It will be here in the morning. And if you can learn to make that surrender gently, night after night, you will have practiced 10,000 times the only thing any of us will finally be asked to do.